It's my privilege today to introduce Liana Downey. She's an experienced senior executive and strategy expert with a strong interest in energy policy and security. As executive director for Liana Downey Associates, she advised federal and state governments and nonprofits across New York and Australia. At McKinsey Company for over a decade, Liana worked with businesses, state and federal governments on gas and energy policies. She was a special advisor to the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Recently, Liana was Deputy Secretary for Strategy and Delivery at New South Wales Department of Education. She has taught at New York University's Wagner School of Public Leadership. She's also the author of a must-read book, Mission Control: How Governments Can Focus and Achieve More. A hearty welcome to you, Liana. And I observe that there are really great giants in this field who have joined us today. Thanks very much. I foresee a very lively discussion of the challenges and opportunities for Australia's future energy policy. We are looking forward to your active participation, which is sure to enrich and inspire. This is a platform to make new connections so that the sparks we gather today can ignite real momentum for change. Back to what Graham shared, we have Liana presenting till 6:30, after which we'll open the floor for discussions. And if I may request you to send your questions, chats in the chat just to me, that would be very useful. Thanks again. We will wrap up the session just a few minutes before 7 p.m. I will hand over to Liana.
Thank you very much, Neja, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, Graham and Reinvent Australia, for welcoming me today. Thank you, Neja, also for that beautiful welcome to country or acknowledgement of country. I'm on Camaragal land here today in Sydney, in lockdown, like many of you, I suspect, in lockdown around the country. So as Neja said, I have an interest in energy, and I kind of am of the view that all Australians should have an interest in energy, because it ties into so many aspects of our lives. And I'd love to talk to you a little bit about some of the things that I've learned recently. So I've spent the last 6 months re-immersing myself in this space. As Neja pointed out, most recently I was in a senior government role for the New South Wales state government. My context and history is strategy. So I've spent the last 6 months talking to over 90 experts in a variety of sectors and fields, all around the questions of energy resources and the economy and an environment, and what that means for Australia, and the question of how can we safeguard our future in Australia. So a really important topic for Reinvent Australia. And I'm particularly interested in the question of how can we safeguard our economic and environmental future. I'm not persuaded that that we need to make a trade-off between the two, as I think is sometimes very much the discussion in Australia, that it's kind of one or the other. And I think there's a really interesting opportunity for us to think about ways in which we can safeguard both and create a really vibrant and exciting future for Australia. So I want to start by sharing a photo with you here of taken 20 years ago, when I was participating in the commercial negotiations for the gas pipeline that was to run parallel to the James Bond gas pipeline. If any of you have seen, there's a great James Bond where he shoots through the gas pipeline. I'm seeing some nods in recognition. So I had the privilege of working with the Georgian International Oil Corporation in Tbilisi. And I talk about this because that discussion really got to the heart of energy security concerns as they were about 20 years ago. And I'm here in the photo, you can see Lord John Brown, the fellow to my right, who was the head of BP at the time, Edward Shevardnadze, who was the president at the time and was soon deposed in a coup not that long after, Janet Radin, who was an international human rights lawyer and representing Georgia in those negotiations, and the dashing young fellow on the right, was also in Georgia doing some work for other infrastructure assets, and is now my husband. Those were really interesting negotiations because the US had a really strong interest in making sure that Georgia and this deal was successful, because they wanted to have access to oil and gas that came not from Russia. So geopolitical security has always been a really important aspect of oil discussions. Some of you will have a more lively memory of the 1973 oil embargo. For others, it will not be something that they lived through, but it was a really important tipping point in the way that the world thought about energy security. So just a quick reminder for those who don't remember, there was an embargo, so a ban on trade that was put out by the major oil producing nations against countries who were net importers of oil. And that meant reduced supply, a shortage of petrol and gas and oil in those countries. And more importantly, it led to a 300% increase in oil prices. Perhaps even more importantly, it led to a massive shockwave through the economy and really underpinned at that time the ways in which energy and oil were really interlinked with the economy. So at that point, those who were on the receiving end of that embargo got together and said, we need to have a plan, as crisis is often such a good thing for getting you thinking in different ways. We need to have a plan. So the International Energy Agency was formed. It now has 30 member countries. And there were three main strategies that were put together by the International Energy Agency. The first was about stockpiling reserves. So thinking we need to have some reserves in case something happens to make access to oil less straightforward. We need to watch and maintain a watching eye on energy markets, and we need to commit together to conserving and sharing supplies in the event of a disruption. So that strategy then of stockpiling oil is an expectation and obligation for all countries who are members. Unfortunately, when you look at what is happening for Australia, Australia is well below its threshold level for oil. So if you look at the days on supply, we have 78 days on supply, well below the threshold that we are expected. But that also means that our strategy at the moment, and you might say, well, how much does oil matter? We use coal a lot here and we have access to other resources, but 98% of transport in Australia requires liquid fuel, and 39% of our energy consumption last year alone was oil. And so it does get you to thinking about the fact that this reliance on kind of goodwill for countries to send us some of their oil if they're in a situation of crisis, it's a good thing to challenge our thinking on that. So if you think about where we are at the moment, if you think about the similar approach around sharing of resources, when push comes to shove, countries have an obligation and an impetus to protect their citizens first and foremost. There's an interesting question for us about whether or not the kind of global goodwill is enough. And there are a number of other really important things that are shifting and changing the way that the world is thinking about energy security. Energy use obviously has changed a lot in history and will almost certainly continue to change. And I think that's important as we think about in Australia, whether we can manage a transition like this, a transition away from fossil fuels and into other fuels. To acknowledge that the transition amongst fuel types is actually something that we have done as humans for a long period of time. And that's been driven by changes in technology and affordability. What has happened historically is that those changes have tended to happen over longer periods of time than some of the shifts that we're seeing at the moment. But traditionally, we relied on wood as a fuel. So you'll see that there, the green line, biomass. The Industrial Revolution kicked off with coal and all the complications that came with that as well, in terms of, if you think about London and the London fog and some of those, the sort of challenges that came with coal. Oil then took off as we developed new technologies for extraction and refinement, gas a little bit later. And then, as you'll see most recently in the last decade, a rise in other different types of fuels, and of course nuclear as well over the last number of decades. So energy use changing a lot. And of course, the geopolitical environment in which we're operating has also changed a lot too. I think it's fair to say that, you know, things are moving fast. If you think about where we were in the 70s, our relationship with the US was much more important at the time than the relationship we have with China. And of course, Russia as an emerging power, still very relevant in kind of energy discussion. So we're operating in a changing geopolitical context. Another thing that really is something that was very deeply reinforced to me 13 years ago when I was at a conference of reinsurance specialists. Probably not the most exciting conference you might imagine, but for those of you who don't know what reinsurance is, reinsurance are the agencies and the groups that insure the insurers. So, you know, when GIO, when we have a big storm and there's a whole lot of payouts that need to be made to homes, insurance companies balance that by having reinsurance companies. So reinsurance companies are one of the most interesting places to get information about risk and about what's happening in the world. And 13 years ago, a very theatrical reinsurance specialist presented a graph not unlike this one that went back actually much further in history and talked about one thing that they were particularly worried about. This was 13 years ago, which was the rapid increase in the number and cost of adverse weather events. So this chart here looks at events that cost more than $1 billion. And you can see that there's a number of different types of weather events. And you can also see the kind of cost line trending up. So this is something that's been worrying reinsurance companies for a long time. And it's relevant for our energy assets because often those weather events impact our energy assets. So if you think about what's happened in Australia over the last few years, these are just some examples of big weather events over the periods of time that have knocked out homes and made energy less accessible. So those storms, the heat waves have increased, and we've also seen an increase in the number of outages from homes as a result of that. So another challenge as we think about energy security. Another challenge for us in Australia is that our coal infrastructure is aging. Coal assets, as all big energy assets, have a finite life period. Where we are in Australia at the moment is that the coal assets that are responsible for generating over 2/3 of our energy capacity are more than 30 years old. That's really starting to get to end of life. As we know, already some of those assets have come online to retire, but many more are due to shortly. In the same context, renewable costs have dropped dramatically. So just to give you a couple of examples, and this, I was involved in doing work forecasting the different energy costs again about 13 years ago. And at the time, we were looking at kind of the best available information about what we thought might happen to solar and wind. And I can tell you now, we were trying to be conservative in those forecasts and realistic, but the rate and acceleration of these costs have exceeded everybody's expectations. Even the Australian market energy operator, who spend their time deeply modelling this, have been out in that these drops have exceeded people's expectations. So there's been an 82% decrease in the rooftop solar, 39% decrease in wind onshore, and you can just see, 47% down, 29%. So really massive drops. Now, that's kind of interesting, but it really only matters in the context of other costs, of other assets in terms of, the choices that we have available to us as we think about those assets aging out. And this is an analysis that's done by a US company, and it's been done every year since 2009. And it looks at globalized costs, and these don't include subsidies. So this is not, oh, solar's cheap because the government's, paying for rooftop, installations or whatever. This is without any subsidies, and this is looking on a comparative basis since 2009. And what's really important here is not just those dramatic drops that I've just described, where you can see solar dropping right down there to 37, and you can see gas coming down as well, of course, solar thermal coming down, wind coming down, but it's also in the context of coal kind of staying staying at the relatively the same rate, and also being in absolute terms higher. So this is the thing that's really shifted. For countries now that do not have coal assets, it is now cheaper for them to build, to go into solar. So that's been the really big dramatic shift in the last couple of years, and really is kind of underpinning some big shifts and changes in the way that a number of different countries are thinking about their energy mix. That presents challenges for us in Australia, because we rely on coal exports for our some of our export dollars. The New South Wales Treasury has forecast that they expect coal sales will fall by about 40% from 2030 to 2061. That might even be revised further down in light of some new announcements this week from Japan about some targets that they've set. And for those of you who have been reading the Business Times, you might have noticed that there are a couple of major energy assets in Australia who have had big drops to their share prices on the result of that announcement, because it means that the forecast demand for our exports is not what it once was. And so we as a country really need to start thinking, even purely from an economic perspective, about how we understand that the world is shifting, and that we need to be thinking about shifting with it, or perhaps ideally even a little bit ahead of it. One of the things to reflect on in Australia is that we do have some extraordinary opportunities. So yes, obviously we have cheap coal, but we also have some of the best solar, geothermal, and in fact wind resources. That wasn't something that I realized until I started to do the research, but the wind levels that offshore off the coast of the West Australian coast and in other areas around reach extraordinary levels and are the envy of many countries around the world. We obviously have commodities. That's important for a couple of reasons. One, because they're needed in the production of some of these renewable technologies, but also because we have the potential, as some of these technology emerge, to produce green. So I'm saying that because, green's a term that's really bandied about, but this is low carbon or zero carbon or greenhouse gas emissions, aluminium and steel. So potentially big export opportunities for us, and they're bigger export opportunities for us also because it means that we can, at the moment we're exporting the raw materials. In many cases, we might be able to bring some of that production here, because it's not something that other countries already have an expertise in. Of course, we also have the raw materials and the mining expertise, and we have a highly skilled engineering and sort of technologically savvy workforce. So it gives us some really interesting opportunities as we think about the ways in which the global energy sort of world is shaping. And all of that means a few different things. It means that people who think about security and energy security a lot, so I've spoken to people in defense, I've spoken to people who are experts in other kind of, geopolitical and international relationships and those security issues, as well as energy. And it means that there's a shift in the way we think about what energy security means from us. So it's less about stockpiling and it's more about independence. It's less about thinking about how we kind of protect single assets, and it's more about building resilient assets, understanding that we will still continue to expect some of those adverse weather events. There's more of a shift from single large scale assets, and these new technologies enable local assets, which is a really interesting opportunity, particularly for regional and rural communities, and something I'll share some quotes later about the ways in which some rural communities are getting really quite excited about the opportunities that local energy generation can provide. That also means, and this is a real challenge for Australia's system, because we are a big country geographically, so and we have an infrastructure that's built around this kind of single point connection. So it's moving more towards the multi-hub approach. And it does mean it's a move away from coal and oil and more towards a mix of renewables. There's an interesting question for us. Is this feasible? Is it feasible to make this shift? I think it's interesting to reflect on countries that share some similarities and some differences with us. Spain is moving rapidly to set itself up as a solar superpower. The UK has moved faster than any other OECD country in terms of shifting to renewables, and they've focused primarily on wind. Germany, which is a country that does have a lot of coal production themselves, is also making a shift. And interestingly, California, I mean, we don't often think about kind of California in terms of its size, but I thought it was useful to just compared to Australia's GDP, it's more than double Australia's GDP at 3.1 million for the state. Sorry, those population figures are incorrect. It's 39 million is the population. So, you know, a big, also geographically spread out state, making some really interesting and aggressive moves into this space. I also find it really interesting to kind of reflect on the kinds of people who, as I've started to look into energy and some of these kind of concerns and risks, are putting forward views that might traditionally be seen as kind of, you know, greeny views. And I just think it's kind of interesting to reflect on. These are people whose total single-minded interest is kind of risk assessment. So generally pretty dry. And two of the biggest global reinsurance companies are here talking about climate change as the biggest long-term global risk to the global economy, and really sort of focusing on the fact that a thorough understanding of climate change is essential for an insurer's risk management. So I thought that was interesting, again, remembering that these are the insurers of the insurers. Interesting also from the former defence chief, a quote here, that the 2020 Black Summer fires exposed weaknesses in responding to extreme climate-related events, and a concern from the Defence Force that Australia is really just not as prepared as we need to be for climate-related disasters. And even obviously, given that we are as a country pretty experienced in dealing with bushfires compared to many parts of the world. An interesting quote here from farmers, as I mentioned, there are some really interesting opportunities that are emerging for farmers and for rural communities when you think about what a transition to a renewable energy would mean. And so Farmers for Climate Action here, a sheep farmer in New South Wales who heads up that organisation, talking here about really seeing that the renewable energy transformation is a once in a century opportunity to revitalise regional Australia, and a real call for a plan that's really thoughtful, that thinks about local jobs, increases the autonomy of the regions, and lowers electricity jobs. So some interesting calls there. And again, I guess from emergency services who you know, very close to the field. And I certainly found this in conversations with fire agencies and state fire agencies around Australia, a common theme that the observations of veteran firefighters who've worked in this field for very long periods of time, that what they are seeing is very different from what they've seen in the past, and a need and an opportunity to act. I also thought it was interesting that in the most recent Australian Institute of Company Directors survey, so this is, you know, the group that represents board directors from all around Australia, they were surveyed both on their long-term priorities and on their short-term priorities for government, and they listed #1 for long-term climate change, #2 energy, and the same for short-term. In terms of priorities for infrastructure investment, they listed #1 renewable energy, #2 regional areas. So a similar kind of theme than you're hearing from some of the groups in the bush. And another thing that I was quite surprised by actually was that 76% favour large-scale public investment in renewable energy and in greening the economy. So some really interesting and convergent views from some pretty different groups across society. Sorry, and just one more, which I thought was interesting. This is a group of corporations who are coming together, and this is only a sample of the corporations. It's a long list and growing. 30 organisations. Sorry, the Department of Defence shouldn't actually be on there, because this is all just kind of corporations, but really also calling for an opportunity to come together and plan for a future together. So, I mean, I think really the opportunity for us is there is a tremendous risk in Australia that we are the Kodak of countries, that we stay doing something because we're really good at it. And there's no mistake, we are really good at coal, and we export it and we're doing well. But what all of this has told me over the last 6 months is that the world is shifting, And there is a tremendous risk for us that because we are really good at this, and as a result, we have a lot of entrenched interest, so interest in kind of staying the course, that we get left behind. So I guess a call for action, I think, is for all of us to be open-minded to the prospect of change. We're certainly having a good lesson in it now with COVID, maybe not the best kind of change. And I guess the other thing, perhaps COVID also useful for thinking about, you can't plan for everything, but there are a lot of signals that would suggest that what we don't want to do is not plan. We don't want to put our head in the sand and say, look, we're really good at coal, can we just kind of keep doing that? The world is shifting in very, very rapid ways. And so there is a real opportunity to plan for a transition in ways that are thoughtful and sensible. I don't want to suggest, by the way, that this will be easy or that renewables are a quick, clean and simple answer. Like any new technology, there are problems with renewables. And people are working them out as we go, which is all the more reason for as many people as possible to be involved in a thoughtful transition and plan. I think the other thing that's really struck me as I've spent time in this space is just the volume of information. If you start to ask questions about energy, if you start to ask questions about coal, if you start to ask questions about the climate, you are absolutely inundated with information, not all of it accurate. There is a lot of misinformation out there. And what I have really challenged myself and the people that I've been working with on some of this research is to question everything, to look for the original article, to look for the original research, to make sure that there's a source, and be careful about kind of flicking something on blindly, no matter what your views, because I think one of the things that has changed dramatically over the last 15 years is the way in which information travels and the ability of unchecked misinformation to fly around. We used to watch the same news. We used to read similar newspapers. We used to get similar information that had editorial oversight. That's not the world we're living in. And it's all the more reason to make sure that we've got really good, thoughtful information and that we come together and think about how we can plan for our future in Australia. So thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit. I'm really hoping we might have a vibrant discussion, not just be taking questions necessarily, but if there are people who have views to share and want to answer some of those questions, feel free to jump in as well, because there is a lot to know in this space, and I appreciate that many people on the call will have expertise and insights to share as well from your own background.
Thanks very much, Liana. This is an eye-opener indeed. And we're really grateful for all the great insights. It's clear we love this fact that we have opportunities galore in Australia, and we've got to be on the front foot. May I put Nigel on the spot? Nigel, if you are around, can you introduce yourself and share some of your views?
Okay, thank you for putting me on the spot. I missed the start of the presentation, so there are some key things that I probably don't know. So I think it would be helpful to hear that. I mean, there was a lot of very interesting stuff, and I'm pleased that a lot of the key things that a lot of people seem to me to be doing wrong weren't in the presentation. So I didn't hear a big promotion of hydrogen or anything like that, so that's good. But there's so many aspects of this. But the key question I think I have right up front is, who is we and what's our leverage? So I don't know who else is on the call. So what's our leverage to make some of these things happen? Because there are really big ideas here, and it's great to be a part of it, but how do we have leverage to actually make any of this change?
Graham, I think that might be a good one for you to talk a little bit about the role that Reinvent Australia has and that you play, and then I'm happy to share some of my perspectives on that. But I think you probably know a little bit about who's on the call and how you think about driving and supporting policy change more broadly.
I hope you can hear me okay. I was just relaxing there and waiting to hear what else said. But I think she's asking a bigger question there, Liana, in terms of political will, markets, and so on, rather than Reinvent Australia's role. And it struck me in your presentation, excuse me, that and it was really good. I loved it. I loved it because I think that it was agnostic about the source of energy. The other thing, though, and I think this is what you're indicating, is that the markets will sort this out, or at least that's one impression I got, because the markets are sorting it out in terms of renewables coming down in cost and coal remaining pretty much the way it was. So that's a bit of an optimistic view on where we've gone. So I'd be interested in your views about that. The other thing is that it's not quite, when you think about a market, excuse me, when you think about markets, they're not actually uncontrolled. And this is another thing about markets. We think about free markets, but how many are free markets? There's subsidies here and subsidies there. But the other thing I think that makes this a bit tricky, and you might just respond to this, is there's someone that doesn't have a voice here. It's the environment, the species that are declining, and so on. So if we just let lowest cost reign, we might be overlooking some externalities in the whole thing. And I think that's another issue that makes it a motive. If we start to think about the coral reef and so on, and certainly in my case, I think about species depletion, and that becomes an overriding factor in a lot of this. So this is why I think it's not an easy topic, because one, markets are not free. There's subsidies in the markets, there's externalities in the market, and there's emotional issues in terms of climate and species and all that. And so that's why I think it's become a vexed issue. It's not a simple one, like what's the cheapest. So what do you think about all that?
Thanks. Liana, you have only 2-3 minutes because there's a long list of questions. I don't want to have people miss out.
So look, just a couple of quick thoughts. In response to the question, who are we and how can we drive change? I think we are first and foremost voters. And I think it's important for us, I think it is a leverage point for us to communicate to our local members things that are important to us. I think that's something that, is always a lever and important for conversations. I think we also have an opportunity to participate in conversation and to come together with, we're a diverse group as I look around, and, I know some people and don't know some people, and I think that's important too. I think the way in which we participate unwillingly or not in information trails is actually a source of power and influence. And that's why I was talking about misinformation and misinformation trails. And then in terms of the questions, will the market sort this out? I think you've actually kind of answered your own question in some senses, Graham. The big challenges, and there are lots of economists who've thought about this deeply, and they would say, yes, the markets don't work at the moment because we don't have the externalities factored in. Most economists are still pretty in favour of getting much more sophisticated about pricing all forms of pollution. That's not something that Australia is sort of settled with yet, but it's certainly something that's happening in other parts of the world. And you're absolutely right about the issue of subsidies. We often talk about the subsidies, and I think they're more transparent to us, the subsidies that exist for some of the renewables. But in fact, there are a lot of subsidies that have and do exist for our fossil fuels as well, some of which are extending the life of assets. So you have this interesting situation in which some cases you've got coal asset owners who want to retire, and the government asking them to hold them open. So I think the other thing that's really challenging for us in Australia is the way in which those subsidies kind of play out in political influence and conversations. And I've certainly spent time on the corporate side as well. I understand that landscape well and the importance of protecting shareholder interests. But that that can and does come in opposition to the environment at times. So yeah, the markets, there's more work for the markets to be able to sort this out, I think.
Liana, thanks very much.